Black World, Black World, Black World TV.
Welcome, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, to Black World TV, the new black media. Today's broadcast is about the Electoral College's racist origins. More than 2 centuries after it was designed to empower Southern white voters, the system continues to do just that. This broadcast is brought to you by the editorial commentary from Wilford Codrington III, a fellow at NYU School of Law. It was published in The Atlantic. So the question starts, is a colorblind political system possible under our Constitution? Well, that question I find very offensive because there is no colorblind anything in a world that is built around race. Our system that's worldwide, that's been affected by the system of white supremacy, is always based on race, where color is a factor, the number one factor. So the article should start off with the question, is a fair and just political system possible under our Constitution? That question would have been much more appropriate, but I digress. If it is, the Supreme Court's evisceration of the Voting Rights Act in 2013 did little to help matters. While black people in America today are not experiencing 1950s levels of voter suppression, efforts to keep them or us and other citizens from participating in elections began within 24 hours of the Shelby County versus Holder ruling and have only increased since then. In Shelby County's oral argument, Justice Antonin Scalia cautioned, quote, "Whenever a society adopts racial entitlements, it is very difficult to get them out through the normal political processes," unquote. Ironically enough, there is some truth to an otherwise frighteningly numb claim. American elections have an acute history of racial entitlements, only they don't privilege Native Black Americans. For centuries, white votes have gotten undue weight as a result of innovations such as poll taxes and voter ID laws and outright violence to discourage racial minorities, which that should read racial majorities, from voting. The point was obvious to anyone paying attention, as William F. Buckley argued in his essay, quote, "Why the South Must Prevail," unquote. White Americans are, quote, "entitled to take such measures as are necessary to prevail politically and culturally," unquote, anywhere they are outnumbered because they are part of, quote, "the advanced race." Now I want to pause for a second, family, because I want you to understand and hear those words, because I want to read them one more time so that you catch this. It says that white Americans are, quote, "entitled to take such measures as are necessary to prevail politically and culturally anywhere they are outnumbered because they are part of the advanced race." Now, family, that whole paragraph I just read is troubling and problematic in so many ways, but I just want to deal with what I'm going to cover and just leave it for you to figure out the rest. So they're telling in so many ways, because anytime they word anything that says that, quote, "anywhere they are outnumbered," tells you a great bit that the lies that you've been told how they are a majority, and they give you an outrageous number how they are a majority, just tells you how that the majority of them that are included in their numbers happen to be these others. They happen to be the others who are of different ethnic backgrounds, but they have come to this country under the banner of white so that they get certain benefits over the native black Americans. This I have always found so highly offensive because the country my ancestors built have been at the lowest rung of the same country that we built up and made great. We have been at the lowest rung, and it's been at the hands and the consequences of evil people. I don't even need to discuss who they are. We know who they are. But when they say things that they are an advanced race is very highly offensive, because the only place where you find advanced civilizations has always been in Africa. The evidence is abundant. The only reason why you don't know this is because you're not taught this in the American school system. But if you go past that and educate yourself by reading other manuscripts written by other historians outside of the white American school system, then you find out that much of what you've been told has been lies or half truths. And so I digress on that point, but I find it offensive when they say that they are an advanced race, because there's nothing advanced about the people who consider themselves as such if they're not from Africa. But I digress. But America's institutions boosted white political power in less obvious ways too, and the nation's oldest structural racial entitlement program is one of the most consequential, the Electoral College. Let me read that again. And the nation's oldest structural racial entitlement program is one of its most consequential, the Electoral College. Commentators today tend to downplay the extent to which race and slavery contributed to the framers' creation of the Electoral College, in effect whitewashing history. Of the considerations that factored into the framers' calculus, race and slavery were perhaps the foremost. Of course, the framers had a number of other reasons to engineer the Electoral College, fearful that the president might fall victim to a host of civic vices, that he could become susceptible to corruption or cronyism, sow disunity, or exercise overreach. The men sought to constrain executive power consistent with constitutional principles such as feudalism and checks and balances. The delegations to the Philadelphia Convention had scant conception of the American presidency, the duties, powers, and limits of the office. But they did have a handful of ideas about the method for selecting the chief executive. When the idea of a popular vote was raised, they griped openly that it could result in too much democracy. Now, I have to pause for a second. I find that troubling when some men caution about too much democracy. How could one have too much freedom? Too much democracy? But I digress. With few objections, they quickly dispensed with the notion that the people might choose their leader. But delegates from the slaveholding South had another rationale for opposing the direct election method, and they had no qualms about articulating it. Doing so would be to their disadvantage. Even James Madison, who professed a theoretical commitment to popular democracy, succumbed to the realities of the situation. The future president acknowledged that, quote, the people at large was, in his opinion, the fittest, unquote, to select the chief executive. And yet, in the same breath, he captured the sentiment of the South in the most diplomatic terms. Here it is. Quote, there was one difficulty, however, of a serious nature attending an immediate choice by the people. The right of suffrage was much more diffusive in the northern than the southern states, and the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of the Negroes. The substitution of electors obviated this difficulty and seemed on the whole to be liable to fewer objections, unquote. Well, behind Madison's statement were the stark facts. The populations in the North and South were approximately equal, but roughly 1/3 of those living in the South were held in bondage. Because of its considerable non-voting slave population, that region would have less clout under a popular vote system. The ultimate solution was an indirect method of choosing the president, one that could leverage the 3/5 compromise. The Faustinian bargain they'd already made to determine how congressional seats would be appropriated. With about 93% of the country's slaves toiling in just 5 southern states, that region was the undoubted beneficiary of the compromise, increasing the size of the state's congressional delegation by 42%. When the time came to agree on a system for choosing the president, it was all too easy for the delegates to resort to the 3/5 compromise as the foundation. The peculiar system that emerged was the Electoral College. Right from the get-go, the Electoral College has produced no shortage of lessons about the impact of racial entitlement in selecting the president. History buffs and Hamilton fans are aware that in its first major failure, the Electoral College produced a tie between Thomas Jefferson and his putative running mate, Aaron Burr. What's less known about the election of 1800 is the way the Electoral College succeeded, which is to say that it operated as one might have expected, based on the embrace of the 3/5 compromise. The South's baked-in advantages, the bonus electoral votes it received for maintaining slaves, all while not allowing those slaves to vote. One man, one vote, that just didn't exist, made the difference in the election outcome. It gave the slaveholder Jefferson an edge over his opponent, the incumbent president and abolitionist John Adams. To quote Yale Law's Akil Reed Amar, the third president, quote, metaphorically rode into the executive mansion on the backs of slaves, unquote. That election continued an almost uninterrupted trend of Southern slaveholders and their dough-faced sympathizers winning the White House that lasted until Abraham Lincoln's victory in 1860. In 1803, the 12th Amendment modified the Electoral College to prevent another Jefferson-Burr-type debacle. 6 decades later, the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, thus ridding the South of its windfall electors. Nevertheless, the shoddy system continued to cleave the American democratic ideal along racial lines. In The 1876 presidential election, the Democratic Samuel Tilden won the popular vote, but some electoral votes were in dispute, including those in, wait for it, Florida. An ad hoc commission of lawmakers and Supreme Court justices were impaneled to resolve the matter. Ultimately, they awarded the contested electoral votes to Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, who had lost the popular vote. As a part of the agreement known as the Compromise of 1877, the federal government removed the troops that were stationed in the South after the Civil War to maintain order and protect black voters. The deal at once marked the end of the brief Reconstruction era, the redemption of the Old South, and the birth of the Jim Crow regime. The decision to remove soldiers from the South led to the restoration of white supremacy in voting through the systemic disenfranchisement of black people, which continues to this day, and those are my words, but virtually accomplishing over the next 8 decades what slavery had accomplished in the country's first 8 decades. And so, the Electoral College's misfire in 1876 helped to ensure that Reconstruction would not remove the original stain of slavery so much as smear it onto the other parts of the Constitution's fabric and countenance the racialized patchwork democracy that endured until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What's clear is that more than 2 centuries after it was designed to empower Southern whites, the Electoral College continues to do just that, to empower Southern whites. The current system has a distinct adverse impact on black voters, diluting their political power. Because the concentration of black people is highest in the South, their preferred presidential candidate is virtually assured to lose their home state's electoral votes. Despite black voting patterns, to the contrary, 5 of the 6 states whose populations are 25% or more black have been reliably red in recent presidential elections. 3 of those states have not voted for a Democrat in more than 4 decades. Under the Electoral College, black votes are submerged. It's the precise reason for the success of the Southern strategy. It's precisely how, as Buckley might say, the South has prevailed. Well, before I continue, let me pause here for a second. I want to say that when they say that 3 of those states have not voted for a Democrat in more than 4 decades, that's under the presumption and the assumption that blacks should vote Democrat all the time. You see, family, this is how white supremacy has prevailed, in my opinion, is that they want us to vote opposite of whatever they're voting, so that way they can continue to trick you and get you to vote one way while they vote another, and whatever way they vote, they get all the benefits. Do you see how this game is played, family? I hope you can expand on that point. I want you to do the thinking for yourself. But I digress. Among the Electoral College's supporters, the favorite rationalization is that without the advantage, politicians might disregard a large swath of the country's voters, particularly those in small or geographically inconvenient states. Even if the claim were true, it's hardly conceivable that switching to a popular vote system would lead candidates to ignore more votes than they do under the current one. 3/4 of Americans live in states where most of the major parties' presidential candidates do not campaign. More important, this quote, voters will be ignored, unquote, rationale is morally indefensible. Awarding a numerical few voting enhancements to decide for the many amounts to a tyranny of the minority. Under any other circumstances, we would call an electoral system that weighs some votes more than others a farce, which the Supreme Court more or less did in a series of landmark cases. Can you imagine a world in which the votes of black people were weighed more heavily because presidential candidates would otherwise ignore them, or, for that matter, any other reason? No, that would be a racial entitlement. What's easier to imagine is the racial burdens the Electoral College continues to wreak on them. So critics of the Electoral College are right to denounce it for handling victory to the loser of the popular vote twice in the past 2 decades. They are also correct to point out that it distorts our politics, including by encouraging presidential candidates to concentrate their efforts in a few states that are not representative of the country at large. That's another area for sure. But the disempowerment of black voters needs to be added to that list of concerns by far, because it is the core to what the Electoral College is and what it has always been. The race consciousness establishment and retention of the Electoral College has supported an entitlement program that our 21st century democracy cannot justify. If people truly want ours to be a race-blind politics, they can start by plucking that strange, low-hanging fruit from the Constitution. This story is part of the project, quote, The Battle for the Constitution, unquote, in partnership with the National Constitution Center. Again, this is edited by Wilford Codrington III, who is a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law. This is the end of my broadcast. This is Black World TV, the new black media. Hoping you like, share, and if you haven't already, subscribe. And we'll be bringing you more broadcasts like this. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next broadcast. Peace out.